For decades, they dominated New York, two identical giants, rising higher than almost everything around them, cutting the sky in half, visible from miles away, from bridges, from highways, from rooftops, from airplanes. No matter where you were in the city, you could see them, the Twin Towers. For millions of people, they were more than buildings. They were a symbol of power, of money, of ambition, of America itself. They looked strong, untouchable, permanent, like they had always been there, and like they always would be. But that was an illusion. When most people think about the Twin Towers, they think about one day, one moment, one tragedy. But this story does not begin there. It begins decades earlier, with a decision that almost no one questioned, a decision to build something so big, so expensive, so risky, that many experts believed it should never be built at all. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, New York was changing. Factories were closing. Shipping was moving away. Old industrial neighborhoods were dying. Lower Manhattan was losing business. Companies were leaving. Jobs were disappearing. Investors were worried. The financial heart of America was slowly weakening, and city leaders were afraid. Afraid of decline. Afraid of losing status. Afraid of losing control. They needed something bold, something dramatic, something impossible to ignore. They needed a symbol. So they came up with an idea. What if they built the biggest office complex in the world? What if they created two towers higher than anything ever built before? What if they forced the world to look at New York again, not with sympathy, but with respect, not with concern, but with admiration? It sounded brilliant. It sounded powerful. It sounded visionary. But it was also dangerous, because no one had ever done this before. Not at this scale. Not in this location. Not with this level of risk. Two towers, over 400 meters tall, hundreds of thousands of square meters of office space, tens of thousands of workers every day, all concentrated in one place, on unstable ground, near water, in a crowded city. It was an engineering nightmare, a financial gamble, a political experiment, and yet, they decided to do it. Construction began in the mid-1960s. Almost immediately, problems appeared. The soil was weak. The foundation was complicated. Water from the Hudson River threatened the site. Engineers had to invent new techniques, new materials, new systems, new safety methods. Nothing about this project was simple. Everything was extreme. To create space, entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Old buildings were demolished. Small businesses were removed. Families were displaced. History was erased. Thousands of people lost their workplaces, their homes, their routines, so that two towers could rise. It was controversial. Protests happened. Criticism grew. But money and politics were stronger. And the project continued. The towers grew slowly, floor by floor, month by month, year by year. Steel frames climbed into the clouds. Glass covered the skeleton. Elevators were installed. Electrical systems were built. Air conditioning networks were created. It was one of the most complex construction projects in history, and one of the most expensive. Costs exploded. Budgets were exceeded. Deadlines were missed. But no one wanted to stop. Stopping would mean failure, and failure was unacceptable. When the towers were finally completed in the early 1970s, they shocked the world. They were massive, dominating, unmissable. They changed the skyline forever. Suddenly, New York looked different, more aggressive, more vertical, more ambitious. It was architecture as a statement. We are still number one. We are still powerful. We are still ahead. But behind the celebration, there was a problem, a serious one. The towers were too big, too empty, too expensive, too ambitious. From the beginning, companies were hesitant to move in. Rent was high. Space was overwhelming. Operating costs were massive. Many offices remained empty. For years. Entire floors. Unused. Silent. Dark. The biggest buildings in the world struggled to find tenants. The public didn't see this. Tourists saw beauty. Workers saw prestige. Media saw success. But accountants saw something else. Losses, maintenance costs, security expenses, energy bills, insurance, repairs, upgrades. Every year, the towers demanded millions just to exist. Politicians had promised a financial miracle, but reality was different. The complex depended on government support, on subsidies, on special deals, on political protection. Without it, the project might have collapsed. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Why did they really build them? Was it about business? Was it about profit? Was it about efficiency? Or was it about ego? Power? Image? Fear of decline? The need to look strong? Even when things were fragile, from the outside, the Twin Towers looked perfect. From the inside, they were a compromise, a balance between ambition and reality, between pride and practicality, between dreams and danger. And that balance was unstable, long before tragedy, long before headlines, long before history changed. The Twin Towers were already a gamble, a bet that size could solve problems. That height could replace stability. That visibility could replace security. That symbolism could replace logic. They were built to show strength, but they were born from fear. Fear of decline, fear of irrelevance, fear of losing control. And when buildings are born from fear, they carry it forever. This is not the story of destruction. This is the story of decisions, of risks, of pressure, of ambition without brakes, of what happens when cities try to prove something to the world and to themselves. Because the Twin Towers were not just buildings. They were a message, and every message has consequences. Every giant project has a public story and a private one. The public story is clean, optimistic, simple. We are building for the future. We are creating jobs. We are strengthening the economy. We are investing in progress. But the private story is always more complicated, more political, more aggressive, more dangerous. And the Twin Towers were no exception. Behind their construction stood not architects, not engineers, not businessmen, but power, political power, institutional power, and financial influence. The driving force behind the project was the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, a powerful government agency, almost invisible to the public, but incredibly influential. It controlled bridges, tunnels, ports, transportation networks, trade routes, money flows. It operated across state borders. It answered to almost no one, and it had access to enormous budgets. If the Port Authority supported a project, that project usually happened. In the late 1950s, the Port Authority was searching for a new role. Its traditional functions were becoming less important. Technology was changing. Shipping patterns were shifting. Competition was increasing. The agency feared losing relevance, and relevance meant power. So it needed something big, something historic, something that would justify its existence, something that would make it untouchable. The World Trade Center became that opportunity. The idea was sold as an international hub, a place where global companies would meet, where trade would flourish, where America would show leadership. It sounded noble, but it was also strategic. If the Port Authority controlled the largest office complex in the world, it would control massive financial flows, rental income, leases, investments, influence. The towers were not just buildings. They were instruments. However, not everyone agreed. Local businesses were furious. Small companies feared being destroyed. Real estate developers saw unfair competition. Why? Because the Port Authority had special privileges, tax advantages, legal protections, public funding. Private companies could not compete with that. They accused the project of being monopolistic, anti-market, dangerous. Lawsuits were filed, protests organized, criticism grew. Politicians were divided. Some supported the towers. They wanted jobs. They wanted votes. They wanted prestige. Others opposed them. They feared backlash. They feared economic damage. They feared urban chaos. But politics is about deals, not ideals. And deals were made. One of the biggest obstacles was location. Lower Manhattan was already crowded. Land was expensive. Property owners resisted. Developers protested. Communities complained. So the Port Authority used its legal power. Eminent domain. Forced purchase. Legal pressure. Entire districts were taken. Sometimes against the will of owners. Sometimes at unfair prices. Sometimes under threat. It was legal, but brutal. Behind closed doors, negotiations were intense. Bankers, lawyers, lobbyists, politicians, executives. Everyone wanted something. Contracts, positions, influence, funding, support. The towers became a bargaining chip. Support this project, and you'll get something in return. This is how megaprojects are born, not through consensus, through pressure. Money was another battlefield. Officially, the towers were presented as self-financing. Rent would cover costs. Income would exceed expenses. Profit would follow. But internal reports showed doubts. Demand was uncertain. Maintenance costs were extreme. Economic risks were high. Still, projections were manipulated. Optimistic scenarios were promoted. Worst-case scenarios were ignored. Because no one wanted to stop. Too many reputations were at stake. Once construction began, it became unstoppable. This is a key moment. Megaprojects reach a point where failure becomes impossible. Not because success is guaranteed, but because stopping would be more expensive than continuing. By the late 1960s, billions had been spent. Thousands were employed. Political promises were made. International attention was focused. Canceling the project would be humiliating. So even critics stayed silent. Inside government meetings, the tone changed. Early doubts disappeared. Publicly, everyone became supportive. Privately, many were nervous. But no one wanted to be responsible for collapse. It is easier to continue a bad idea than to admit a mistake. The Port Authority also used marketing, press releases, media partnerships, promotional campaigns. The towers were portrayed as the future, the world center, the symbol of globalization, the heart of commerce. Criticism was marginalized. Opposition was framed as backward, unpatriotic, anti-progress, and in Cold War America, that was dangerous. International politics played a role too. The United States wanted to show strength to Europe, to Asia, to rivals, to allies. The tallest buildings in the world were not just architecture. They were propaganda. They said, we lead, we dominate, we innovate, and that message mattered, especially during periods of uncertainty. Inside the Port Authority, careers depended on success. Executives who delivered the towers would become legends. Those who failed would disappear. So personal ambition mixed with institutional goals, and rational analysis lost importance. As construction progressed, opposition weakened. Businesses adapted. Communities relocated. Courts approved. Politicians moved on. The towers became inevitable. A fact. A reality. A finished decision. By the time they opened, no one talked about early doubts. No one remembered early warnings. No one mentioned economic risks. History was rewritten. The towers were presented as a triumph, as if success had always been guaranteed, as if failure had never been possible. But it had been. Many times. At many stages. The project survived not because it was perfect, but because it was protected. By law. By politics. By money. By power. This is the uncomfortable truth. The Twin Towers were not built by consensus. They were built by force. Legal force. Economic force. Political force. Symbolic force. They existed because powerful institutions wanted them to exist. Not because markets demanded them. Not because cities needed them. Not because people asked for them. But because leaders needed a monument. And when buildings are created by power, instead of necessity, they carry that power's weaknesses. Its arrogance. Its blindness. Its impatience. Its fear. The Twin Towers were not only engineering projects. They were political artifacts, frozen in steel and glass. They represented an era where ambition mattered more than caution, where image mattered more than stability, where size mattered more than sustainability. In Act 1, we saw fear and ambition. In Act 2, we see something deeper: control, manipulation, pressure, deals, compromise, and sacrifice, all hidden behind beautiful words. The towers did not rise naturally. They were pushed into existence, against doubts, against resistance, against logic, and that would matter later. More than anyone expected. When the Twin Towers opened, the headlines were triumphant. The world's tallest buildings. A new era for New York. A global center of trade. An economic miracle. Photographs showed shining glass, flags, crowds, ceremonies, smiling politicians, confident executives. Everything looked like success. Everything sounded like victory. But behind the cameras, behind the speeches, behind the applause, a different story was unfolding. Quietly, slowly, in spreadsheets, in reports, in private meetings. From the beginning, the biggest problem was simple. No one needed that much space. The towers had been designed for tens of thousands of workers, for hundreds of companies, for an endless flow of tenants. But reality was different. Many businesses were shrinking. Others were moving to cheaper areas. Some preferred smaller buildings. Some preferred suburbs. Some preferred flexibility. The future was changing, and the towers were built for the past. In the first years after opening, large parts of the complex were empty. Entire floors, entire sections, sometimes entire buildings. Lights were off. Offices were silent. Corridors were unused. The tallest buildings on Earth had nothing happening inside them. This was embarrassing. For politicians, for the Port Authority, for everyone who had supported the project. So they tried to hide it. They avoided publishing vacancy numbers. They emphasized potential. They talked about future growth. They blamed temporary conditions. But internally they knew. Demand was weak. To attract tenants, rents were lowered. Special deals were offered. Discounts were given. Flexible contracts were created. Some companies were practically invited in for free, just to fill space, just to avoid empty windows, just to protect the image. This created another problem. Lower rent meant lower income. Lower income meant financial stress. And financial stress meant dependence. Dependence on government support, on political protection, on special arrangements. The towers were no longer independent. They were being supported, artificially. At the same time, costs were enormous. The Twin Towers were not normal buildings. They were machines, vertical cities. They required massive electricity, constant air conditioning, complex elevator systems, permanent security, advanced fire systems, continuous maintenance, specialized staff. Everything was bigger. Everything was more expensive. Everything broke faster. Every year, millions of dollars were spent just to keep the towers running, not improving them, not expanding them, not upgrading them, just keeping them alive. Elevators needed constant repairs. Glass panels had to be replaced. Steel structures required inspection. Heating systems failed. Cooling systems struggled. Leaks appeared. Corrosion developed. Wear accumulated. And because of the size, every small problem became a big expense. Insurance was another nightmare. 2 massive towers, thousands of people, billions in property, in one location. From a risk perspective, it was dangerous, extremely dangerous. Insurance premiums were high, and they kept rising. Security costs also grew. After terrorist attacks in the 1970s and 1980s, awareness increased. Guards, cameras, barriers, checkpoints, surveillance systems, all had to be installed. All had to be maintained. All had to be paid for. Safety was expensive, and becoming more expensive every year. Meanwhile, the economic environment kept changing. The 1970s brought inflation, energy crises, recessions, uncertainty. The 1980s brought deregulation, competition, new financial centers. The 1990s brought globalization, technology, remote communication. Companies no longer needed giant offices. They needed networks, flexibility, mobility. And the towers were not flexible. They were massive, rigid, permanent, difficult to adapt. Slowly, They began to feel outdated, not physically, but conceptually. They represented an old idea. Centralization. Everyone in one place. One massive headquarters. One dominant center. But the world was becoming decentralized, distributed, connected digitally, and the towers didn't fit that future. Inside the Port Authority, concerns grew. Reports showed declining profitability, rising costs, limited growth, high risk. Some analysts warned, this project will never fully pay for itself. It will always need support. It will always be fragile. But again, no one wanted to admit it publicly. Publicly, the towers were still presented as a success. Tourism brochures, business magazines, promotional videos. They showed busy lobbies, full restaurants, crowded plazas. But cameras never filmed empty floors. They never showed unused offices. They never focused on financial losses. The image had to be protected, because the image was the project. If people stopped believing in it, everything would collapse. In the 1980s and 1990s, attempts were made to reinvent the complex. New shops, restaurants, events, cultural spaces, conferences, exhibitions, anything to increase traffic, anything to increase income, anything to justify existence. Some efforts worked, others failed, but none solved the core problem. The towers were simply too big. Privately, officials began discussing alternatives: leasing, restructuring, privatization, selling management, reducing public responsibility, transferring risk. They wanted out, but carefully, quietly, without scandal. By the late 1990s, one conclusion was clear. The World Trade Center was not a financial miracle. It was a burden, a prestigious burden, a symbolic burden, but still a burden. It consumed attention, consumed money, consumed political energy, and delivered less and less in return. The towers were impressive, but inefficient, famous, but expensive, iconic, but fragile. They survived, not because they were strong, but because they were protected. Protection by governments, by laws, by contracts, by image, by fear of embarrassment. Without that protection, they would have been questioned, restructured, or even dismantled. And this created a dangerous situation. When something survives because it is protected, not because it is healthy, it becomes vulnerable. One shock, one crisis, one mistake can expose everything. By the turn of the century, the Twin Towers stood as symbols. But behind the symbols, the numbers were weak, the margins were thin, the risks were high, and the future was uncertain. In public, they represented confidence. In private, they represented compromise. Between ambition and reality, between pride and practicality, between past dreams and present limits. The towers had been built to show economic strength. But economically, they were always struggling, always adjusting, always depending, always fragile. And soon, that fragility would be tested in ways no one expected. For many years, the Twin Towers looked untouchable, too big to fail, too famous to fall, too important to be threatened. They dominated the skyline. They dominated business. They dominated imagination. And because of that, people believed they were safe, not because they were protected, but because they were important. And that belief was dangerous. In the modern world, visibility is power, but visibility is also vulnerability. The taller something is, the easier it is to see. The more famous something becomes, the easier it is to target. From the moment the towers were completed, they became global symbols. And global symbols attract attention. Not all of it positive. As early as the 1970s, security experts were raising concerns. They warned that concentrating so many people in one place was risky. They warned that evacuation would be difficult. They warned that emergency response would be complicated. They warned that attacks, accidents, or disasters could have massive consequences. But these warnings were uncomfortable. They threatened the image, so they were minimized, ignored, delayed. For decades, safety was treated as a technical problem. Install alarms, add guards, build cameras, write procedures. On paper, everything looked fine. But real safety is not about paperwork. It is about preparation. And preparation was incomplete. Then, in 1993, reality broke through the illusion. On February 26th, a truck bomb exploded in the underground parking garage. It was powerful, violent, terrifying. It tore through concrete, killed 6 people, injured more than 1,000, filled stairwells with smoke, cut electricity, trapped workers. Thousands had to escape in darkness, down dozens of floors, without light, without guidance, without communication. It was chaos. For the first time, the world saw something clearly. The towers were not invincible. They could be attacked. They could be damaged. They could be paralyzed. They were vulnerable. Investigations followed. Reports were written. Committees were formed. Recommendations were issued. They pointed to serious weaknesses: poor evacuation systems, inadequate communication, confusing stairways, insufficient emergency lighting, lack of coordination, security gaps. The message was clear. Major changes were needed, and some changes were made. Better lighting, improved radios, more guards, restricted access, reinforced structures, security drills, updated procedures. On the surface, it looked like progress, but underneath, problems remained. Many recommendations were delayed. Some were only partially implemented. Others were quietly ignored. Why? Because full protection was expensive. Because major redesigns were complicated. Because acknowledging vulnerability was uncomfortable. Because it raised political questions. Because it suggested that earlier decisions had been wrong. And no one wanted that. After 1993, the towers continued operating. Offices reopened. Shops resumed. Tourists returned. Life went on. The explosion slowly faded from public memory. People preferred to believe it had been an exception, a rare incident, a one-time event, not a warning. Inside management circles, however, anxiety remained. Security budgets increased. Meetings became more frequent. Threat assessments were conducted, but these efforts were often reactive. They responded to past risks, not future ones. At the same time, global terrorism was growing. International attacks increased. Radical groups gained attention. Governments warned about new threats. Intelligence agencies discussed new scenarios, including attacks on symbolic targets, including attacks on landmarks, including attacks on skyscrapers. But these discussions rarely reached the public and rarely led to radical changes. Part of the problem was psychological. After decades of stability, people believed disasters happened elsewhere, in other countries, in unstable regions, not in New York, not in America, not in the financial capital of the world. That sense of immunity was powerful and misleading. Another problem was institutional. Responsibility was fragmented. Security involved building management, private contractors, city authorities, federal agencies, emergency services. No single organization had full control. No single authority had full responsibility. When everyone is responsible, no one truly is. Technology was also advancing faster than protection. New materials, new fuels, new explosives, new methods. Attackers were learning, adapting, innovating. Security systems were slower, bound by budgets, by regulations, by politics, by bureaucracy. The gap was growing. Throughout the 1990s, the towers remained under quiet threat. Threats were reported. Warnings were investigated. Some were serious. Others were false. Most were forgotten. Each time nothing happened, confidence grew. Complacency returned. Public perception was shaped by media. The towers appeared in movies, in advertisements, in postcards, in television shows. They were romanticized, normalized, turned into background scenery. They became part of everyday life. And when something becomes normal, it feels safe, even when it is not. By the late 1990s, a strange contradiction existed. Security experts knew the towers were risky. Management knew the towers were vulnerable. Authorities knew the towers were symbolic targets. But society behaved as if everything was fine, as if risk had been solved. as if danger had been eliminated. In reality, it had only been postponed. The 1993 bombing was not an isolated event. It was a test, a message, a preview. It showed what was possible. It showed what could happen. It showed where weaknesses existed. And it showed that attackers were willing to strike. But the lesson was not fully learned. It was partially absorbed, partially forgotten, partially buried under routines, under budgets, under politics, under comfort. Instead of asking, how do we completely rethink safety? Many asked, how do we return to normal? And returning to normal became the goal. Not transformation, not radical improvement, normality. By the turn of the century, the Twin Towers stood once again as symbols of confidence. Busy, crowded, photographed, admired. But beneath that surface, unresolved risks remained. Structural, institutional, psychological, strategic. The towers were stronger than before, but not strong enough. More protected than before, but not protected enough. More aware than before, but not prepared enough. They had survived one attack, and survival created illusion. The illusion that they would survive anything. History shows that illusions are often the most dangerous things of all. The warning signs were there. The evidence existed. The risks were known. The questions had been asked. The answers had been postponed. And soon, the cost of postponement would become clear. By the late 1990s, the Twin Towers had entered a strange phase. They were no longer new, no longer revolutionary, no longer controversial. They had become normal, part of the background, part of daily life, part of the city's identity. People stopped questioning them, stopped analyzing them, stopped worrying about them. They were simply there. And when something is simply there for long enough, it feels permanent. After decades of struggle, losses, and political protection, the complex finally appeared stable. Offices were mostly occupied. Tourism was strong. Shops were busy. Restaurants were full. The plaza was crowded. From the outside, it looked like the project had succeeded, like the gamble had paid off, like the critics had been wrong. Internally, many officials felt relief. The worst seemed over. The towers were working. They were generating income. They were no longer an embarrassment. They had become a respected part of Manhattan, a symbol that had survived. But this stability was fragile. It was built on careful management, on constant adjustments, on hidden compromises, on silent support. It was not natural. It was maintained. In the late 1990s, another major change occurred. The Port Authority began discussing privatization. After decades of direct control, officials wanted out. They wanted to reduce responsibility, reduce political risk, reduce financial exposure, transfer the burden to private companies. In 2001, this plan became reality. The World Trade Center was leased to a private developer for billions of dollars. For nearly a century, it was one of the largest real estate deals in history. On paper, it looked like success. The state had secured revenue. Responsibility was transferred. Risk was shifted. The project was finally independent. But privatization also brought new pressures. Private companies think differently. They focus on profit, efficiency, cost control, return on investment. Every dollar matters. Every expense is questioned. Every upgrade must be justified. This created tension. Security upgrades were expensive. Structural improvements were costly. Emergency systems required investment. And now, someone had to pay. And no one wanted to. Management tried to balance everything. Safety, profit, public image, tenant satisfaction, political expectations. It was a difficult game, and compromises were inevitable. At the same time, the world was changing fast. The late 1990s were a period of optimism. The Cold War was over. The economy was growing. Technology was booming. Globalization was accelerating. The internet was transforming business. Many believed history had entered a safe phase, a period without major conflict, without major threats, without major shocks. This belief influenced everything, including security, including planning, including priorities. People assumed stability. They assumed continuity. They assumed tomorrow would look like today. After decades without major disasters, complacency had returned. The memory of 1993 was fading. Younger workers didn't even remember it. For them, the towers had always been there. Always safe. Always functioning. Always normal. Inside the buildings, life felt routine. People arrived in the morning, drank coffee, used elevators, answered emails, attended meetings, looked out of windows, went to lunch, worked late, went home, day after day, year after year. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing seemed dangerous. Nothing seemed unstable. The towers had become vertical cities. Tens of thousands of people depended on them. For jobs, for income, for careers, for identity. Entire industries operated inside them. Finance, trade, law, technology, media. They were ecosystems, not just buildings. This created emotional attachment. People felt proud to work there. They told friends. They brought visitors. They took photos. They felt important, part of something big, part of something historic. And that pride reinforced trust. If so many people work here, it must be safe. If so many companies invest here, it must be reliable. If the government supports it, it must be protected. This logic was comforting and misleading. Behind the scenes, risk assessments continued. Threat reports were written. Scenarios were discussed. Emergency drills were conducted. But they were limited, constrained by budgets, by regulations, by assumptions, by politics. No one expected the unimaginable, because imagining it was uncomfortable. Another problem was human nature. People adapt to risk. They normalize it. They learn to live with danger until it no longer feels dangerous. Skyscrapers once felt terrifying. Now they felt normal. Crowded offices once felt risky. Now they felt routine. Massive concentration of people once felt alarming. Now it felt efficient. The towers embodied this normalization. They were extreme, but familiar, complex, but accepted, risky, but trusted. In the final years before 2001, the World Trade Center reached its peak. High occupancy, strong tourism, global recognition, stable management, strong revenues. On paper, everything looked good, better than ever. Politicians pointed to the towers as proof of success. Developers praised them. Media celebrated them. Business leaders trusted them. They were presented as a model, a triumph of urban ambition, a lesson in perseverance. Few remembered how close the project had come to failure, how dependent it had been on support, how vulnerable it remained, how many compromises were hidden inside its walls. The towers had survived decades of problems, political battles, financial struggles, security scares, economic crises, and survival created confidence. Confidence created complacency. People began to believe, if it survived all that, it will survive anything. That belief was the last illusion, because history does not reward endurance. It tests it. By the summer of 2001, the Twin Towers stood at their strongest, economically stable, politically accepted, socially integrated, culturally iconic. They had become part of the world's imagination, and that made them more visible than ever, more symbolic than ever, more meaningful than ever, more attractive than ever. To those who wanted to make a statement, the buildings had been born from ambition, protected by power, sustained by compromise, stabilized by routine, and surrounded by trust. Everything that made them successful also made them vulnerable. The illusion was complete. The city felt safe. The buildings felt permanent. The future felt predictable. And no one knew how close that illusion was to breaking. After everything that happened, after decades of ambition, after billions of dollars, after political battles, after economic struggles, after warnings, after compromises, after illusions, one question remains. What were the Twin Towers really about? They were never just buildings. They were never just offices. They were never just steel and glass. They were an idea, a message, a declaration. They said, we are strong. We are powerful. We are unstoppable. We are in control. They were built to convince the world and to convince their creators. From the very beginning, the towers carried expectations. Too many expectations. They were supposed to revive a city, save an economy, prove political strength, show technological dominance, create profit, inspire confidence, and symbolize leadership, all at once. No building can do that. No structure can carry that much meaning. No project can survive that pressure forever. The Twin Towers tried. For more than 30 years, they tried. They adapted. They survived crises. They overcame criticism. They endured attacks. They adjusted to markets. They reinvented themselves. Again and again, they did everything that could be asked of them. And still, it was not enough. Because their biggest weakness was invisible. It was psychological. They were built from fear. Fear of decline. Fear of irrelevance. Fear of losing status. Fear of losing control. And when projects are born from fear, they are always unstable. No matter how strong they look, powerful people believed that size meant safety, that height meant protection, that money meant control, that symbolism meant strength. They believed that if something looked untouchable, it would be untouchable. But history does not work that way. History does not respect appearance. It respects reality. The towers were impressive, but complex, efficient, but fragile, iconic, but vulnerable. They concentrated too much, too many people, too many functions, too much meaning, in one place, in one structure, in one symbol, and concentration always creates risk. After their destruction, the world changed, not only emotionally, but intellectually. Urban planners rethought skyscrapers. Security experts re-examined assumptions. Governments rewrote protocols. Architects reconsidered design priorities. Cities questioned symbols. The idea of bigger is better was challenged. For the first time in decades, limits were taken seriously. The empty space in Lower Manhattan became something else. A memorial, a place of reflection, a place of memory, a place of silence, where once there had been noise, movement, ambition, pressure. There was now stillness. And that contrast matters. It forces us to think about what we build, about why we build, about who we build for, and at what cost. The Twin Towers remind us that success is fragile, that dominance is temporary, that power fades, that symbols age, that control is an illusion. No matter how rich you are, no matter how advanced you are, no matter how confident you feel, they also remind us of something deeper, that human beings often try to solve emotional problems with physical solutions, fear with height, insecurity with size, uncertainty with monuments, doubt with visibility. We build bigger when we feel smaller. New York did not need the tallest buildings in the world. It needed balance, stability, investment, community, resilience. But leaders chose symbolism because symbolism is faster, easier, more visible, more political, and more dangerous. Today, new towers stand where the old ones once rose. They are safer, stronger, smarter, more carefully designed, but they are also quieter, less aggressive, less arrogant, more humble. They reflect a different philosophy, one shaped by loss. The original Twin Towers were children of their time, an era of confidence, competition, expansion, and unchecked ambition. They were monuments to a belief that progress had no limits. That belief was wrong. In the end, the towers did not fail because they were weak. They failed because they were asked to be too much. A business center, a political symbol, a cultural icon, a national statement, a financial engine, a security fortress, all in one. Nothing can be all of that. Their story is not only about tragedy, it is about choices, about priorities, about incentives, about pressure, about the cost of ignoring doubt, about the danger of confusing image with reality. The Twin Towers stood for 30 years. In historical terms, that is nothing. Empires last longer. Cities last longer. Ideas last longer. Only symbols fade quickly. And yet, in those 30 years, they changed the world. They shaped a skyline. They shaped careers. They shaped politics. They shaped culture. They shaped memory. They shaped history. They were built to last forever. They lasted one generation. That is the final lesson. Nothing built on fear is permanent. Nothing built on ego is stable. Nothing built on illusion is safe. The towers rose. They dominated. They fell. And now, they teach. Not through height. Not through power. Not through dominance. But through absence. Because sometimes, the most important monument is the one that reminds us to be careful with ambition, to respect limits, to listen to warnings, to question symbols, and to remember that strength is not about being the biggest. It is about being the wisest.